Hey guys, we're in episode 8 of Ask Yourself, breaking down leadership traits. How to spot crappy leadership.
Ask Yourself is a learning discussion where we seek questions to be more intentional of how we understand ourselves.
We are two friends who are trying to make sense of ourselves and the world together. Hi, I'm Nina Guno. I'm a writer who looks for humanity in the news.
And I'm Elisha Corpus. I'm a consultant who brings humanity into the workplace.
Hey everyone, we've made it into episode 8.
I know! It's been a month!
Yes, and I'm really thankful to everyone who's been sticking through this. But before we can get more into episode 8, I think we should kind of backtrack since it's been a month, right? So what did we talk about last time?
Yeah.
Episode 7.
So, again, we wanted to dig into leadership traits. So, it was all about breaking down leadership traits. But in episode 7, we focused on how do we stop choosing crappy leaders. And the first big point that we tried to make was that how we can stop choosing crappy leaders is to first get to the nature of our assumptions about leadership. Because a lot of us, we tend to assume that you are born to be a leader, that there's someone out there who will save us from everything bad happening. But really, if you look at the definition of leadership, it's a skill. It's something that we can all learn, we can all develop, and so, really, we can all be leaders. And we don't have to be waiting for someone out there who will fix everything for us.
Yeah, that connecting that also to what we know now or what we how we view leadership right now. So we have certain expectations, but they're more based on certain qualities of how a leader can appeal to us. And this is so evident when it comes to campaigns when there's like somebody running for a political post or any form of office, and we tend to expect that they should be really confident, that they should command a crowd, they should dazzle us with their singing and dancing. And that's great. I get it. That you want somebody that you can really connect to. But as we said, leadership involves skills that you have to learn. And because if we only limit leadership to those certain qualities, then we tend to overlook the other skills or the other competencies that come with leadership, and then we end up being disappointed with our choices, right?
Yeah.
So why we went into how to stop choosing crappy leaders is we want to make better choices for leaders, right?
Yep. And I mean, to your point, our gut feel and our personal preferences, we're not saying that's wrong. I think the last big point we tried to make in the last episode was that the leadership traits we gravitate towards, they do say a lot about our own values and what matters to us. And so it's not about completely forgetting your gut feel, but it's being able to hold those two truths that one, I have my own personal preferences, and also two, there are certain standards that I do have to pay attention to as I choose and as I select who I prefer.
So today what we're going to talk about is the role of leadership. And that, as opposed to criticizing individual leaders and saying this is what a crappy leader looks
Oh,
like.
so easy to do that.
Yeah, it's so easy to do that. I mean, it's natural, it's human, obviously, but why are we talking about the role of leadership? And even before we get into that, what do we mean by the role of leadership? Can you expand on that, Elijah?
Yeah. I mean, when we were thinking about what this episode could be like, we realized that when it comes to leadership conversations, we tend to, pick a certain person and then look into why they're a good leader or not, which is also very good discussion. You get a lot of richness out of it. But again, that's so specific to that person versus what we want to try to do today is to maybe take a step back to try to zoom out into what is leadership as a position anyway? What are the standards that we have to uphold for that position? It's sort of like a job description, right? So in the corporate world, when we want to fill a certain position or a certain job, we have a very clear criteria of the kind of person we're looking for. And if they don't fit, then we don't hire them. And I think that's kind of what we're looking for. Like, what is that criteria for a leadership position?
Exactly. And we've seen the pitfalls when we don't have that criteria. Right? So as we mentioned, we tend to go with our gut feel because we don't know what that criteria is supposed to be, right? So we just think about this person doesn't really sit right with me, or wow, this person really appeals to me. But what we want to do also is to dig into why we like or don't like a leader. And then maybe from there, you can actually set standards, right? So we've established that we want to set standards, we want to set criteria about what we want to see in our leaders. How do we start with that? How do we start doing that?
I mean, I think especially when it comes to a specific position or a specific role that we're trying to fill, we do need some sort of understanding of the competencies tied to that role. In the corporate world, for example, this is something that any recruiter will be familiar with. We have a set of competencies for a job, and then the people we hire are tied to that specific competency. They are measured against it. And I think in the corporate world, for example, all the way up to your development plans or the decision to let you stay or let you go, a lot of it is tied to the competency of the job or the role that you're in. So it's very important to have an understanding of that.
How do you establish those competencies though?
Yeah, so competencies are just your knowledge, your skills, and abilities that are required or tied to a specific job. So if you think about maybe a specific position, these are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed to be able to fulfill that role.
Okay. Okay, what do we before we get into competencies and establishing what we want to see in good leadership or what we think about bad leadership, can we go first into what knowledge is, what skills are, what abilities are, and what's the difference between the three?
Yeah. And that's very important because, again, like what we've been saying, right? Sometimes we gloss over the job description of a leader and we just assume that because someone is charismatic or because someone is so inspirational, then they are leaders or they should be leaders. But we don't look into the competencies attached to the position they are trying to run for. Yeah, okay. So, knowledge, if you think about knowledge, these are your technical know hows. If you think about the things you've read in a book, like theories or concepts, these are what would make up your knowledge piece.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then as opposed to skills, is it like the application of that knowledge?
Yeah, so skills, exactly. These are more the application of what you've learned. So these can be observed maybe through a person's training or a person's past experiences. Maybe would help if we give an example, right? So if we look
Yeah.
at leadership competencies specifically, a knowledge would probably be something like I know what leadership means as a definition. Or it can also be I know the four basic functions of a manager. So these
Mm.
are concepts that you can learn in a book, you can read up on a website, and they can help you to be a leader because you have the words to be able to describe what you're doing.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just just to comment on that, I think because we've seen leaders who don't seem to know what leadership means, or don't know exactly what the four functions of
Mm-hmm.
management are, then we've seen some pretty incompetent leadership
Yeah,
because they don't even know where to start.
I mean, like, to be fair, it's not always that book smart is
Yeah,
prioritized,
of
right? Like,
course. Of course.
there are times when we don't need to have that exact definition to be a good person for that role. But I think what we're saying is there's a basic understanding of what it takes to be a leader. And that's what we're looking for when it
Yes.
comes to knowledge.
Okay, I'm getting a bit confused with abilities. I feel like they're kind of like skills. So, what sets it apart exactly from
Yeah.
knowledge and skills?
Yeah. So, and you're right. Even for people in like the field of HR, abilities can be confusing. But the way that my teachers at least have made it clear for me is think about skills as something that you can develop maybe through training or past experience. So in terms of leadership, maybe you were like a vice president of your organization before. So in that position, you were able to practice the skill of leadership.
Okay.
Versus abilities are something that can be more innate in you. In the case of leadership, it's a little bit harder to think about an ability that's required, but we still include abilities because there are some jobs where an innate ability is necessary.
Hmm.
For example, okay, I'll give an example. If you think about people who need to lift heavy loads, so let's say people who have to lift sacks of rice, for example, they have to be a certain height if you look at their job descriptions. And that's because the assumption is if you go below that height, then it becomes unsafe for you to be lifting that heavy of a load. So in these cases, it's very important to look at the natural things that come with a person because it's something that can tell you if they can perform the job safely or not. Does that help?
It does, but also the thing is, when we talked about leadership and we established this like in episode 7, it can be learned by anyone, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you're not supposed to have. It's not supposed to be like a natural ability, I think. So how do we tie that in with what we're talking about now? When we want to spot crappy leadership, but then we want to also, so we want to put the competencies that we need. How do we
Mm-hmm.
put those KSAs and tie that together?
Yeah, I get where you're coming from because honestly, even in HR jobs, when the position becomes something that's less mechanical and more like creative thinking or something
Mm-hmm.
that's less labor oriented
Yeah.
and requires more creative thought or something
Maybe more
that's more,
cerebral.
yeah,
Yeah.
something more cerebral, it becomes harder to differentiate ability from knowledge and
Yeah.
skills.
Okay.
And I think this is where we have to be smarter as people who are setting that standard. For example, if we say leadership as a position, right? You can easily say that a required quote unquote ability is the ability to inspire.
Hmm.
But I would challenge you on that and say the ability to inspire, what do you mean by that? Because we can break it down into knowledge and skills. So, for example, if you say for a leadership position, you need to have an ability to inspire, maybe a skill under that is a skill that requires understanding of one's audience when it comes to
Hmm.
talking. And
Yeah.
so I think when it comes to leadership, you can break it down into further littler pieces that will get you to knowledge and skills.
Ooh. I think that's what we're doing now, right? Because we want to break down leadership traits
Mm-hmm.
and then
Ideally.
break them, yeah, ideally, and then get them more into, oh, this
Mm-hmm.
is the skill that has to be involved or the knowledge that's involved before you can that, and then that translates into that the trait that we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, traits are like the outward manifestation of whatever that competency is. So, I
Oh,
mean, to be honest, I don't think competency is an everyday like word
yeah,
or
it's not.
phrase that we use.
Mm-hmm.
I think when it comes to everyday conversation, a lot of us go by traits, which is not wrong. Like, we're not trying to say that's wrong. All we're trying to say is there are ways to break that down further, and that's what we're trying to do.
Okay. So I think we can better define now what a leader is versus the personality that we're seeing in someone, because usually we kind of get those two mixed up. Like you can gravitate towards this person and really like them, but then when they need to be a leader, then they disappoint,
Yeah.
and it's really frustrating. So I think one thing that we should think about, our first question could be, ask yourself, what's an example of when I liked someone as a person but not as a leader? And what leadership competencies did I want to see from them? Yeah.
That's a big question. And I think what we're trying to emphasize here is it's very context specific.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, if a trait that you value is kindness, let's say, for example, maybe someone is very kind to you in the context of a friendly dinner or
Yeah,
a friendly inuman hangout. But when
exactly.
it comes to them being your manager or your leader, and then you come to them and say, hey, I made a mistake, I don't know what to do, and then they start getting mad at you. So that's not showing kindness in that context of leadership.
Exactly. Okay, and I think that's a good way to get into what we want to do to spot crappy leadership. What's
Mm-hmm.
the process that we've sort of thought of to spot crappy leadership? And that's to really be observant in situations that require leadership. So again, you could really like a person as your parent, as your spouse, even as a teammate, maybe in sports. You can really like love them for that, but then when they're leaders, then suddenly they're like this different person, and you get so frustrated, right? So I think it's really important to evaluate these certain situations where we need leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can explain to us what kind of buckets we came up with.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, right? We all have that gut feel of like, hey, something isn't right. And I think being able to be observant in those scenarios can help us figure out what isn't right so
Mm.
that we can correct it in the future. And
Yeah.
so for us, at least for our episode for today, we bucketed these common situations or scenarios into three. So the first one is looking at people or leaders in terms of how they react in extraordinary situations. Extraordinary situations, we mean things like sudden changes or
Crisis.
obviously a pandemic. Yeah, like
Yeah.
what we're dealing with. So things that don't happen on an everyday basis, but the leader still has to deal with these and figure out how to help the team survive given what's happening.
Yeah, so these are really high pressure
Mhm.
situations. And I think we can give an example. So, really, again, this pandemic has really put a spotlight on what good and bad leadership looks like. And we've seen that not only in government, but even in the companies and
Mhm.
organizations that we work in. So, for example, something that's been happening a lot and it's really devastating is that people are losing their jobs, retrenchment is happening. But here's the thing, like, what could spell a good and bad leader is how they handled that, right? So if you kept employees in the dark about what's happening with the company, you don't tell them like, oh, we're a sinking ship, and then all of a sudden just cut them out, and don't explain what could have been done, or if they have any benefits or something because they had to be cut loose, then you could see a leader, you could kind of judge or assess a leader as bad in that certain situation. For me, I would be really disappointed seeing a leader like that, not giving that sense of comfort, not being transparent. So I would say the trait I'm looking for is really integrity
Mm-hmm.
here, or not just integrity, but really more honesty about what's going on at the time that you need it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at a lot of the literature around leadership and crisis, a lot of them would say that a crisis, because you don't have a lot of time to think, it will show you the natural tendencies of a
Mm.
person. Like, what do they gravitate towards? And who are they? What do they value? And I think
Wow.
that's what you're starting to see with the leaders around us. If when push comes to shove, they don't ask for help, or they try to say they got this but they don't, then I think that's very off-putting to a lot of us, because it shows us that they're trying to save themselves versus everyone else around them.
Oh gosh, exactly. It's so heavy, but
I know.
it's reality, and that's why we gotta talk
Mhm.
about this. So we can go into our second bucket,
Yeah, yeah.
which is also really important. Actually, I feel like for me this is even the most important
Mhm.
because everyone has to deal with this. It's look at how your leader handles everyday or routine situations. So what kind of situations are these?
Yeah. These are the everyday things that happen in your team, in your organization, that you think are not important, but they actually contribute so much to your experience of your everyday. So, for example, something like a staff meeting, right? This happens every week for most teams, and you don't think about it so much because, I mean, hello, it happens every week. But if you think about it, if you don't like that weekly meeting, then that's something that happens every single week that makes you feel sad or annoyed or even angry. And I think a lot of us dismiss the quote unquote everyday routine situations as small, but in reality, these are the bigger things that if a leader is able to create impact in these situations, it's something that can change and craft a more positive experience for everyone around them.
Exactly. Yeah. So, giving an example of team meetings. Oh my gosh. I mean, I think everyone has experienced a bad meeting. And all
Mm-hmm.
the more now that we have to do all these online meetings and they're so much more frequent. And when they do go bad, and by bad, we don't even mean that people fight. It's just that, for example, there's no agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Your boss calls for a meeting and there's no agenda,
Go
there's
on
nobody.
forever.
Yeah, and then so what happens is people are just giving their grievances. It's nonstop. It's so frustrating, right? So with that, the what I would really want to see in that situation is like respect my time. I mean, respect everyone's time also. Um, that's just one trait that I think that applies in that specific
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
situation. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these everyday scenarios can really tell you what the person is in their natural state. And then I think
Mm.
beyond the person who's in the leadership position, our expectation of these everyday scenarios can be a clue as to what do we value or what do we want to see. If we're not satisfied with how things are every day, what is our ideal standard? What is that desired future we're all looking towards? And I think if we take the time to reflect on that, then we can be clearer about what we're trying to get at.
Hmm. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So for our third bucket, we looked at how your leader can handle public facing situations. So when we say public facing, meaning any talking to people, any person outside of
Mm-hmm.
your team,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what kind of situations are those?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what I see with my clients, these are situations where your leader of your team is presenting to their leader or their
Mm.
boss, or maybe it's an organization wide meeting where your
Mm.
team has to talk about what you've been doing, what are your wins, or what are your not so wins, and things like that. We call out this kind of scenario the public facing situation because this is where you can see consistency. So if a leader takes care of you in your team and outside of your team, it shows consistency in how they handle their direct reports. Versus, for example, if someone says in your team that they care for you and then throw you under the bus when they're
Ugh.
outside of your team,
Yeah.
then that's a very inconsistent behavior, and it's something that for the person experiencing that situation, it can be very unsettling.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah. It would be really much harder to trust your
Yeah.
boss in that situation, and I think trust is so important in any company, in any organization. So yeah, as you said, it's really unsettling. So again, we want to look back at specific situations where we expect people to be leaders. And I think it's also fair, just fair to people, because we don't want to be judging a person like on an everyday.
Yeah.
We want to see them as a leader all the time, but they're actually not leaders like every single second of the day, right? So going back to what these buckets are, first one is we look at how leaders handle extraordinary situations. So these are really crisis situations, high
Mhm.
pressure situations, and we see here the reaction when they're under a lot of stress, right?
Mhm.
So for the second one, what's your second one again, Elijah?
Yeah, our second one is looking at how a leader handles the everyday. So these are not high stakes, not high pressure, easily dismissible as boring, but
But so important.
I know, but because they are happening every day, they can impact the experience of every single person greatly.
Yes. Okay, and our last one is look at how your leader handles public facing situations. And these are, for example, when they deal with other teams, when
Uh-huh.
they deal with other bosses or even clients, what they say to you and what they say to those other people. And if it's not consistent, it says a lot about
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
So, and it can be really frustrating if they don't rise to the occasion and be consistent.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I mean, really, of course, we're not saying these are the only situations that you can observe. Think of these as buckets. Buckets of situations where if you start seeing that, okay, I think I'm in that bucket, we can be a bit more aware, a bit more observant, so we can look into what do I want to see from my leader in this moment, and what are my expectations of someone in that position.
So, now that we've been able to give examples, give those buckets where we expect leadership to shine or expect leaders to step up, what now? What do we do with that information?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think at the end of all of this reflection is it's not always that we are in that formal leadership position to be
Mm.
able to do things, right? Like, that's the reality of it. For a lot of us, especially people in our age, we are not there yet. But I think that's not an excuse for us to not reflect on what that could mean or what this is saying about our leadership preferences. And so I think if we try to answer now what, it could be something like, we can use this knowledge from our self reflection to develop our own leadership practices, our own leadership methods, so that when we have our own teams or our own people that we're trying to lead towards a certain vision, then we can enact on those leadership practices that we say are important.
Exactly. I think that can lead us to our second question,
Okay.
where we ask ourselves, what is a situation when I needed a leader to step up? And how would I have handled the same situation?
Ooh, yeah, I love that question because I mean, a lot of us get frustrated by a lot of things, right? I think we are at that age where we have convictions about certain things, and so when we don't see those convictions being met, we can get very frustrated. A lot of like stereotypes about millennials will say that this is bad and we complain a lot, but I think we can see it in the flip side of that, where we complain because it matters.
Yeah.
Maybe this is one of those things where if we don't like how a leader handled a certain situation, and we feel like complaining about it, maybe this is because we have a different idea of how we can approach it. And it pays. It's valuable to reflect on what that different scenario could be.
I think we're always going to look at what could be better,
Mm-hmm.
especially with all that we know now. I mean, I know that now we have all this information, and of course, now we want to be more ethical, I think,
Mm-hmm.
a lot more humane and kinder to each other. And I think with that, what we also want to do with analyzing leaders in in these specific situations where they do have to, be leaders, like make decisions, make plans, and implement them, we want to also give feedback, right? I think that's one thing that you can do, especially if you do have a leader who's receptive to feedback. Why not take this opportunity, right? And knowing, giving feedback based on situations can also be better, because then you can be more specific. You can be more objective, actually, and it wouldn't come off as like a personal attack, like this person's a bad leader because they don't know what they're doing. Like, that's not as helpful as being like, well, this leader isn't very clear in instructions, so this is what I would want to see more of.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said reminds me of how we teach people in organizations to give feedback.
Hmm.
And so, in these workshops, we always say that you don't attack the person. What you
Okay.
try to point out are behaviors. And so, for example, it's very important to be specific about what situation you observed. So, what was the situation? What was the behavior? And what was the impact of that behavior on you? How did it make you feel? What did you think about that behavior? And if you go about feedback in that way, you're not attacking the person for who they are. What you're trying to do is to point out that in this moment, maybe your behavior wasn't the best for the situation. And so this is me telling you about it, and maybe we can talk about some ways to mitigate that behavior moving forward. So I think that's what we're trying to do here. Like, we're not saying that a person who you interpreted their behavior as bad will never change. No,
Yeah.
it's a situation where maybe there's an opportunity to point out that behavior to that leader. And with growth mindset as our main value that's operating here, maybe in the future they can do better.
Okay, and what else can we do with this information? I think better analysis, or more being more critical or discerning of our leaders
Mm-hmm.
around us. Maybe not even in just our workplace. It could even be in our government, whether it's local government or national government. other organizations operating around us. We really just want all of us to be more discerning of leadership. And I
Yeah.
think you can bring us into our last question and what that means. So ask ourselves, after reflecting on the first two questions, what are your non-negotiables in leadership? So I would love to hear from you why we spoke or why we chose non-negotiables as the term here.
Yeah, I mean, non negotiables can be very overwhelming, right? If you just hear that word. But I think from the very beginning of this episode, we've been saying that it's about the position, not
Mm-hmm.
the person that we observe. And so when we think about non negotiables, we start looking at what are those skills, those knowledge pieces that we expect from someone who can fulfill that role. And
Okay.
so our choice of using non negotiable as a word is actually very intentional because we want to point out that yes, your preference matters, and also look into your standards that you're setting for that position. Are you maybe undersettling? Is there a way that you can marry your preference with the standard that you're giving?
Exactly. Okay, so I think it's time that we wrapped up and
Mm-hmm.
look back at those three questions that we were able to process. So, first one is, what's an example of when I liked someone as a person but not as a leader? And what leadership competencies did I want to see from them?
Mm-hmm. And then the next question is, what is a situation when I needed a leader to step up? How would have I handled the same situation?
And the third one is, after reflecting on the first two questions, what are your non negotiables in leadership? Okay, so I guess before we
Mm-hmm.
go, some final thoughts. For me, it's really important to discuss this because I know for myself that I am not as rational as I think. Humans are just generally not
Mm-hmm.
as rational as we think we are. And we just kind of have to find ways to hack our brains so that we pause and think a bit more. So these thinking of these questions are one way to do it. For me, I just really want more thought put into the leaders that we choose in whatever setting. And I feel like if we do that, then we're going to get more good leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even in the context of an organization. So for even for people like me who are in the HR space, we know that we're not as rational as we'd like to be.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect objectivity does not exist. I think that's something, the more we can accept that perfect objectivity doesn't exist, then the more we can work on being more objective. And so for me, this episode is something I really felt strongly about because we have to accept in ourselves that we are not the most rational beings. Like, as humans, we have our own judgments and we do let those judgments affect our decisions. And so let's just accept that so that we can be more open to discussing our preferences, so that we can be more open to discussing our non negotiables with other people. And the more we talk about it, the more we can get clarity on maybe some blind spots we aren't seeing yet.
Exactly. So thank you to everyone who's been listening.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for taking this time to learn with us and for asking yourself the hard stuff.
Bye!
Bye!